Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Senator Lauren Legarda, Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, and welcome to the Bridges Dialogues Towards a Culture of Peace. I'm Professor June Borromeo, and I will be your host and moderator for this afternoon. May I call on AIM President Francis Estrada to deliver the welcome remarks.
Senator Lauren Legarda, Bangko Sentral Governor Amado Tatanco, AIM Chairman Joey Quisio, International Peace Foundation Chairman Uwe Morawetz, former AIM President Roberto Del Campo, members of the diplomatic community, distinguished guests, friends of the Asian Institute of Management, welcome. Despite the turbulence that we have witnessed towards the end of 2007, we had a good year in Asia. The Asian Development Bank expects the region to report a 2007 growth rate of a very respectable 8.3%. The unprecedented losses reported by the world's leading financial institutions arising from the subprime mortgage crisis, massive unauthorized trading losses at a major European bank, and the secular decline in the value of the US dollar have, however, shaken confidence in the international financial system. Exacerbating these concerns are rumblings of an American or US consumer credit crisis, continuing high oil prices, an unsettled Middle East, and escalating turmoil in Africa. How is this all likely to affect Asia, the world's most populous and fastest growing region, factory to the world, and holder of 2/3 of the international global reserves? Has the much referred to decoupling of world economy from that of the US evolved to a point where it will actually cushion the impact of contracting US demand? How does that work in a rapidly globalizing economy? These are difficult questions indeed. But in this context, we are privileged today to welcome Professor Finn Kydland, distinguished Nobel laureate for economics, to share his wisdom with us. Most appropriately, he will speak to us on peace and economic development in the age of globalization. Now a pause for a sponsor, as it were. AIM was established 40 years ago this year to develop managers and leaders for Asia. Over 34,000 participants from 70 countries completed its various programs to date. Not surprisingly, the Institute is a committed advocate to regional economic integration and constructive engagement with the global economy. Professor Kydland's talk to us today follows similar addresses made, among others, by Mr. Pascal Lamy, Director General of the World Trade Organization, Sergei Lavrov, Foreign Minister, Russian Foreign Minister, fellow Nobel Prize laureate Dr. Joseph Stiglitz, and ADB President Haruhiko Kuroda, among others. AIM congratulates the International Peace Foundation for conceiving of the Bridges Dialogues Towards a Culture of Peace program. The idea of promoting relationships between global thought leaders committed to peace and Asian educational institutions and their respective communities is truly special. On behalf of the Asian Institute of Management, thank you all for joining us in what I am sure will be a most enlightening afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, President Estrada. To tell us more about the Bridges Dialogue Towards a Culture of Peace, may I call on the founding chairman of the International Peace Foundation, Mr. Uwe Morawetz.
Magandang hapon po, and welcome to the first ASEAN event series, Bridges Dialogues Towards a Culture of Peace. Bridges is facilitated by the International Peace Foundation, a non-political and non-religious foundation under the common patronage of 21 Nobel Peace Prize laureates based in Vienna. The events are hosted in cooperation with the various local partners, including the country's major universities, and I thank the Asian Institute of Management and its president, Francis Estrada, for hosting our event today. Having started in November 2007, Bridges is being continuously held in the Philippines and Thailand until April 2008, involving the participation of Nobel laureates for peace, physics, chemistry, medicine, and economics. The first ASEAN series of Bridges is an independent contribution to the Decade for a Culture of Peace and Nonviolence, initiated and promoted by the United Nations General Assembly. It follows a series of 250 Bridges events, which the International Peace Foundation has already hosted in Thailand between November 2003 and April 2005. 26 Nobel laureates, as well as 12 other keynote speakers and artists, such as Dr. Hans Blix, the Reverend Jesse Jackson, Vanessa May, and Jesse Norman, participated in these events. They were presided over by Her Majesty Queen Sirikit and Her Royal Highness Crown Princess Mahachakri Sirindorn, and reached an audience of 70,000 participants. As peace cannot be achieved instantly, but is a process which needs time, Bridges has not been organized as a single conference, but as an ongoing series of events in which Nobel laureates and international decision makers have built strong bridges with leaders in all parts of society and with the general public. With the basis for peace being education and synergies being the fruit of cooperation, the International Peace Foundation hasn't realized Bridges alone, but has carried out the program together with UNESCO and 75 other national and international institutions, including 23 major universities and schools. The multidisciplinary and pluralistic approach of Bridges in Thailand and of the events in the Philippines reflects that peace involves all parts of society. It involves awareness and social responsibility of politicians, the business community, scientists, artists, and the media. And since peace within ourselves, our families, and our environment starts in our minds and hearts, it involves every one of us. In this sense, Bridges challenges us to cross borders and to build bridges by listening and opening up to other viewpoints, by generating new thoughts, by developing innovative forms of cooperation, and by fulfilling the desire of everyone to get to know and to learn from each other. This can lead us to a world in which we will be able to understand each other and the complexities we face today in a new light. A globalized world needs broad strategies for change to secure a sustainable future for us and the next generations. Let us be inspired by the knowledge and the wisdom that Bridges continues to offer, an opportunity to get a more inclusive, interconnected, and comprehensive view of ourselves and the world in which we live, in which we are able to create anew constantly through dialogues towards a culture of peace which need the participation of everyone. I thank Professor Kydland, the 2004 Nobel Laureate for Economics, who has agreed to come to the Philippines to support the events. And we look forward to his keynote speech and to his important contribution to build bridges. Maraming salamat po, and mabuhay.
Marami pong salamat, Ginoong Morawetz. May I acknowledge also the presence of the Philippine Honorary Chairman of the Bridges Dialogues Towards a Culture of Peace, Mr. Washington Sisip. May I now call on the Dean of AIM, Professor Victoria Licuanan, to introduce our keynote speaker.
Senator Legarda, Central Bank Governor Amado Tetanco, Mr. Washington Sisip, Mr. Jose Cuisha, Mr. Uwe Morawetz, Mr. Estrada, and Mr. De Ocampo, Mrs. Tonya Kydland, members of the diplomatic community, Bridges partners and sponsors, students and faculty from AIM and from other educational institutions, ladies and gentlemen, a very good afternoon to all of you. It is my great pleasure this afternoon to introduce to you our speaker, Professor Finn Kydland. Professor Kydland has had a long and distinguished academic career, although in his own words, there was virtually no indication earlier in his life that he would become an academic. Professor Kydland is from Norway, having been born on a farm and grew up in a small town about 40 kilometers south of Stavanger, itself the fourth largest city in Norway, with a population, according to Google, in 2007 of 150,000 people. He pursued his bachelor's in economics at the Norwegian School of Economics and Business Administration, and at that point he expected to become a business manager. But when he was finishing his degree, an economics professor offered him a research assistant post, and this proved to be a critical decision that changed the rest of his life. Because of this, Professor Kydland continued at the Norwegian School as a research scholar, and then moved to Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, where he completed his PhD in 1993. And it was also during this time that he met Professor Edward Prescott, who became chairman of his PhD committee. After completing his PhD, Professor Kydland returned to Norway, where he taught at the Norwegian School for 5 years. Then he returned to Carnegie Mellon, and after joined the faculty of the University of California at Santa Barbara in 2004. At various points in his career, he also worked with the Federal Reserve Banks of Cleveland, St. Louis, and Dallas. But our story focuses on the work that he did with Professor Edward Prescott. The two professors began their cooperation in business cycle even when Professor Kydland was a student. In a paper in 1997 called Rules Rather Than Discretion, The Inconsistency of Optimal Plans, the two economists demonstrated how the declared commitment to a low inflation rate by policymakers might create expectations of low inflation and unemployment rates. Now, if this monetary policy were then changed and interest rates reduced, for example, to give a short-term boost to employment, policymakers' credibility is lost, and conditions are weakened by what we call discretionary policy. 10 years later, in another seminal paper, Time to Build and Aggregate Fluctuations in 1987, they demonstrated that technological changes or supply shocks, such as oil price hikes, for example, could be reflected in investment and relative price movements, and therefore create short-term fluctuations around long-term economic growth. Now, these may seem arcane to many people, but this work has very important implications to policymaking. And the work of Professor Kydland, as well as Professor Prescott, has influenced the design of monetary policy in many countries over the past decade. And in recognition of their work, in October 2004, the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences awarded the prize in economic sciences in memory of Alfred Nobel, jointly to Professor Kydland and Professor Prescott for their contributions to dynamic macroeconomics. Today, Professor Kydland will speak to us on peace and economic development in an age of globalization. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm honored to present to you the 2004 Nobel Laureate for Economics, Professor Finn Kydland. Let's give him a big hand.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for coming. I'm delighted to be here to see so many people show up for this event. Very important series of which I'm lucky enough to be part. And so I thank Uwe Morawetz for having included me in this series. And I also thank my wife, Tanya, for being willing to come along, because otherwise I don't leave the North American continent unless she's willing to come along. So you may thank her as well for my being here. This is I have taken the step of putting the word peace into the title of my talk. And it's not as if I'm a big expert on that field. I know it's something that's being studied in various fields of universities and elsewhere. I suppose one of the things I could point to is that I have been going to a conference in Petra, Jordan, for 3 years now, and there'll be a fourth conference coming up in June. This conference is arranged by Elie Wiesel in cooperation with the King of Jordan. And the conference has gone under titles such as Saving the World or Building a Better World. And I have learned to appreciate at those conferences the importance of economic development for peace, the sense in which they go together. I'm not saying that one causes the other necessarily. In some cases, I think economic development is very important for avoiding conflicts. In other cases, things may be going along pretty well, and then conflicts arise, as, for example, recently in Pakistan, where I'm sure some corporations will be nervous about what has happened recently. And I suppose the only other qualification I might point to is I'm a Norwegian. Norwegians are known to travel all over the world to try to broker peace. Also, when Alfred Nobel instituted the Peace Prize, he didn't trust the Swedes to give it out like they do with all the other prizes. The Norwegians were put in charge of the Peace Prize. Now, let me give you a little motivation in the form of some numbers. I like to be quantitative, so whenever I can refer to numbers, that's I'm very happy. This is a collection. It looks like kind of an idiosyncratic collection of countries. It shows the progression over since 1950 until about 2005 for GDP per capita. These are taken from the so-called World Pen Tables, where the originators have done their best to make the numbers comparable across country by adjusting them for purchasing power parity. Obviously a tough thing to do, but for our purpose, the main thing will be to see some big differences across countries, and so small adjustments in these charts wouldn't really have made any difference for us. So here you have, as kind of a benchmark, the United States on top, and then I do have the Philippines in this picture. The Philippines, I don't know if it's going to show up. The Philippines, it's a, what would you say, fuchsia? Yeah, fuchsia-colored, well, like more or less like my tie. The Philippines evidently has been growing steadily, no particular dramatic downturns, although one might argue that it would be good that it grew even faster than it has so far. You'll notice one interesting country is, and I'll come back to that country later, Argentina. Argentina 120 years ago was one of the 5 or 6 richest countries in the world in this sense, one of the 5 or 6 most well-to-do countries. And even into the 50s and 60s, Argentina was doing reasonably well, but starting about 1980, Argentina has fallen on really hard times. And that curve for Argentina, kind of teal, bluish, is among the flattest of all of these countries in this picture. I'll show you two more pictures, and they are more systematic in the sense. Oh, by the way, before I leave that picture, the very bottom one, the yellow, that's the worst case in this plot, and that's Afghanistan. And Afghanistan is a country that has been inflicted with conflicts for decades and decades. This is here we have a number of European countries, and one thing. There are a couple of things interesting about this picture. They more or less go up together. There are a couple of countries a little lower than the others, Spain and Greece. And also in the beginning, Ireland was right in the cluster with Greece and Spain. As you can see, Ireland, the red curve, has really taken off since 1990. Ireland has made a dramatic jump. I mean, about 1990, as you can see, the GDP per capita was about $8,000 in 2005 dollars versus 12 or 13,000 for some of these other countries, Denmark, France, Germany, United Kingdom. By 2005, Ireland managed to catch up with these other countries. And one of my points of the talk is going to be, I think there's a lot to be learned from studying countries that haven't done so well, to look at what could it be about their policies that really hampers their development, and what would be an example of something a country can do if they really want to try to foster economic development. This is a much more depressing picture. Let me draw attention to this vertical scale. So the first two charts, GDP per capita goes from 0 to 40,000. That's the scale of these pictures. This one goes from 0 to 3,000. So 3,000, that would be about 1/13 of the max in the other pictures. And as you can see, there are countries hovering around 500. Very, very depressing. And not only is growth low in some of these countries, but it's highly variable. There could be periods in which there's a good spurt. I believe it's Burundi that shows a big spurt, and then everything doesn't quite fall apart, but relatively speaking. There are some relatively well-behaved countries here. There's Cameroon, the yellow one, the one that's currently at the top of these. There's Lesotho. Lesotho is kind of an interesting country because they're right in the middle of South Africa, and they're sometimes used as an example in textbooks when we talk about the connection between GDP, gross domestic product, and gross domestic income. For the United States, for example, they're virtually identical, and it's true for there are good approximations to each other. For many countries, Lesotho is an example where gross domestic income would be much higher than gross domestic product, because many of their inhabitants cross the border to South Africa, work there, and then they bring home the income to their homeland. So Lesotho is doing relatively well. I have Chad in this picture, the orange curve, and Chad is a recent sad case. Obviously, I didn't know anything was going to happen in Chad because before the country was included in these charts, but so I suppose I showed a little foresight there, unintendedly. So the key message is, if you compare Europe and some other countries to some of these countries where conflicts prevail off and on, it's clear that there's a big difference, and one leads to the suspicion that economic development and peace must be tied somehow. One of the things also Elie Wiesel appears to have realized in his conferences, we're divided in 4 groups, and one of the 4 is especially devoted to studying economic development, presumably as it relates to peace. Let me just give a quick overview of the talk. I will say a few words about the framework of modern macroeconomics. I suppose because I always get nervous if I talk about material that's too far away from my own research, and because the topic of this talk is a broad topic, so there are several subtopics I could have chosen to speak from. So I'll prefer to talk about something that's quite related to my own research, and one of them is this distinction between rules versus discretion. It was mentioned in the introduction, and I'll say a few words about the fundamental reason for the policy inconsistency over time, and the potential bad outcomes from falling into that disease. I'll give 3 or 4 acute examples of where it's more likely to arise, or where it's likely to hit the hardest. I'll use Ireland and Argentina as examples. They are 2 countries I've studied in some detail, and with various co-authors. Argentina with Carlos Sarasaga, who's Argentine, and was very good at coming up with the data and so on. And Ireland with Mark Wynne, who's both of these 2 fellows are economists at the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas. At the end, to the extent I have time left, I'll say a few words, say something more generally about what fosters or hampers economic development. So back to the framework of modern macroeconomics. If you were to look in journal articles, you would see that just about all papers, all research papers fall in this category of being explicit about the decision-making framework of millions of people. People are characterized by their preferences especially over various sorts of goods, and leisure into the indefinite future. So they're very much forward-looking. People are constrained by their budgets over time, the economy as a whole is constrained by their resources. And there's another important resource constraint, namely time, built into these economies. So as I said, these economies, model economies, they can be programmed into a computer even smaller than the one sitting here on the podium. They are explicit about people's decision problems. These models contain thousands of businesses, and one important reason taking them into account is that they, to a large degree, define what's possible to do in the nations. They provide the aggregate capacity to produce stuff. And often we formulate that in the form of an aggregate production function that says how the two major inputs into production, namely capital, the sum of factories, machines, office buildings, and so on the one hand, and labor, all the input by all the workers, how that translates into goods and services, either in the form of consumption goods, households care about, or goods that can be used to augment future capacity. And essential in the production function is a description of technological change. That's a key thing that makes economies grow over time, that makes GDP per capita become larger over time. I keep saying that these economies are forward-looking, and let me just say a little bit about that, or say what it is about these economies that are different from the framework that used to prevail in the 60s or 70s. They're forward-looking in the sense that when you look at decisions today, you take into account the possibilities for the future. In the old-fashioned economies, I'm putting things simply now, but if you were to think about people's willingness or ability to consume, they were formulated in the form of equations whose parameters the researchers hoped to estimate from empirical data using statistical techniques. And these equations weren't particularly forward-looking. They would say something like, well, if income goes up, say, because the government gives you a tax reduction, something like 90% of that income would be consumed. And you get the feeling that in many people's minds, for example, in talking about the temporary fiscal stimulus package, as it's called in the United States, to try to avoid a recession, that many policymakers still think in those terms. But if you're forward-looking, then it turns out it becomes rational to think in terms of, well, if I get a temporary income increase, I'll spend only a small fraction of it, maybe 5 or 10%, and the rest I will save for the future. And that's an example of the sense in which these economies are forward-looking. Same thing with investment behavior. When you think about augmenting future productive capacity, you will think about your best guess about how productive this capital will be, not just next year, but 5 or 10 years into the future. The people who make those decisions, they care about the return after taxes, and so naturally you will also try to make guesses or anticipate what the government may possibly do during the lifetime of this factory in terms of taxation of capital income. And we can talk about similar things involving human capital augmentation through acquiring more education or learning by doing, somehow becoming more skillful for market production. For the purpose of my talk, I think I can go quickly over this, except to say that the key tool we tend to use for quantitative macroeconomics, which is what I'm interested in, the field where we look for answers to quantitative questions that demand a numerical answer, the computational experiment. We build these models of economies, these model of economies inhabited by people. We put them in the environment, in a realistic environment from which we can learn from their behavior. They behave as if they were actual economies over time, and then we compare them with the data. In these economies, and this is going to be key for my talk today, we can also add, in addition to the household sector and the business sector, the government sector. The government serves a very important role in providing many services that otherwise wouldn't have been provided: security, defense of the nation, and many other services that naturally are performed by the government. And the government gets revenue to pay for these services from, for example, taxing capital and labor income and through sales taxes and so on. Now, suppose we think of the government as being benign. The government has some objective function that is similar to the objective function of the typical people. Well, with people being quite different, that's a hard task, but let's just do the thought experiment that there is a well-defined function, a social welfare function, we might call it, an objective that the government is determined to follow over time. And I'll make maybe a kind of a far-fetched assumption for the sake of the argument and say this function doesn't change over time. It's the same function regardless of which party or coalition of parties is in charge. Of course, the factor I'm abstracting from could be an additional complicating factor, but I'll save that for later. It turns out, and this is the thing that Prescott and I found in the paper that was mentioned in the introduction from 1977 about rules versus discretion. The surprising thing we found was that the optimal, in the sense of maximizing this objective, the optimal government policy in general is inconsistent over time. And it requires a commitment mechanism in order to be implemented. If you deviate from this optimal policy, if you are indeed inconsistent over time in this sense, and we thought we provided some rather powerful examples, one in the context of monetary policy, one in the context of fiscal policy, the alternative outcomes can be very bad. Now, the fundamental reason for the inconsistency is, is something that's not that easy to explain to the non-PhD economist. And the reason I know that is when we first presented our paper, the first time I presented the paper at the conference, after about two minutes, all hell broke loose, and everyone was trying to figure out where the mistake was. Now, once you think about it, the reason is not so difficult. If the government were to choose an optimal policy, one that maximizes its unchanging objective function covering today and the indefinite future, that policy, for it to be optimal, it has to take into account the effect it has on people's I mean, I'm talking about households decisions, consumption decisions, labor input decisions, the effect it has on businesses' investment decisions over time. And many of these decisions, as I hope I convinced you of in my a couple of examples of the importance of forward-lookingness, many of these decisions are such that current decisions depend on what people think the government will do in the future. Not just what they're doing this year, but what they will do 5 or 10 years into the future. My example of taxes on capital, future taxes on capital is an example. The importance of it for the investment decision today. But it could also be important for when you think about whether to acquire more, go to school 2 more years for a master's rather than taking a job right away. You might want to think about or have some expectation about how much the additional income from going to school, how much will that be taxed in the future. Now, so that has to be taken into account in this government policy, optimal policy rule. The key thing that makes it tempting to change the policy in the future is, well, suppose we fast forward 5 years. This policy has been followed for a while. Factories have been built. People have become more educated, etc. The government realizes, well, these decisions that dependent on what I'm about to do now, from now on and further into the future, these decisions for the first 5 years have already been made. There's no reason for me to take into account the effect of policy from now on decisions that have already been made. And so that's the key fundamental reason for this timing consistency. Now, where is the temptation the greatest? To me, this is the most powerful case, namely having to do with accumulating something at great cost currently, but something that yields services or a revenue long time into the future. An example is physical capital. Another example is human capital. The tax environment makes a difference for businesses in willingness to invest. Once they've made that investment, once the factory is there, if the taxes were to be raised, most of them would not shut down. They would still continue to operate. It would seem, especially if the government thinks there's an emergency need for revenue, it would seem an easy way to get revenue, and that's part of the temptation. The government would be tempted to say, well, I'm sorry, we're going to tax you heavily now. That goes against what we had promised. Instead, we'll go back to the original tax environment from next year on, or 3 years from now. Now, these kinds of promises, if you've broken your promise once, they're very unlikely to be believed by anyone. Another example, and this is what has happened in many Latin American countries, for example, governments had issued bonds at nominal interest rates and in their own currency. The government could be tempted to renege on their debt. I would call that the partial default on their debt, and an easy way to do it is through a surprise inflation. Under hyperinflations, as happened in the Argentina, Bolivia, and many other countries, this debt could become virtually worthless to the holders, to the government. It has the effect that it costs them virtually nothing in real terms to pay it back. Now, so with this dire problem, or this possibility of this being having a bad effect on the economy, if the government succumbs to that kind of temptation, investors will clearly be more nervous about investing in that country, and economic development is likely to suffer dramatically. It's natural for a country then to think of mechanisms to try to commit itself, try to shore up credibility, try to convince the public that they're not going to do this sort of thing. The examples of mechanisms that have been used, unfortunately, not so much in the context of fiscal policy. And I tend to think that fiscal policy is the most important part of government policy for economic development. In monetary policy, that's also important, of course. In monetary policy, there have been examples of commitment mechanisms, ways of trying to tie your hands. Unfortunately, not always so successfully in the sense of lasting very long. One of the ways that lasted the longest, it lasted for maybe a century or more, was the gold standard, namely tying your currency to the price of gold. But that fell apart so long ago, I'm guessing very few here would remember, and that was before I was born, and so that means that there couldn't be many who remember it. Currency board is another example. Argentina had a very bad decade, as you'll see in a few minutes. In the 1980s, Carlos Menem took over power, and he realized he had to try to do something to shore up the credibility of the nation. And so he instituted a currency board, which meant that they accumulated dollar reserves, and then they committed themselves, supposedly, to tie the peso, their local currency, to the dollar 1 for 1. And that seemed to work for about 8 to 9 years, and then everything fell apart. And one of the things they did was they failed to take into account that monetary policy and fiscal policy are interrelated. They're interrelated, for example, that they're part of the same budget constraint. But more importantly, in Argentina, the provinces had the ability to accumulate debt to pay for their expenses. And in the late 90s, it turned out they had accumulated so much debt they would not be able to pay it back. And then they came running to the government, something that's possible to do in Argentina under their constitution. The provinces don't have a balanced budget law as most states in the United States, for example. And then the federal government had to bail them out, and the debt in Argentina mushroomed. I can't go into details of exactly what made everything fall apart, but the currency board worked only for about 8 to 9 years. The third example is to make central banks, the conductors of monetary policy, independent from political pressure from the rest of the government. And that has seemingly been quite successful in the past 10 or 20 years. Some banks were independent going way back. The one that was known to be quite independent in their behavior, namely the Bundesbank in Germany, is no longer around because Germany is now part of the European Central Bank. So they're part of running monetary policy jointly for a number of nations. The Federal Reserve Board or the central bank in the United States is reasonably independent, although we've seen recently that they're certainly under lots of pressure from policymakers. The Bank of England used to be under the basically under the rest of the government, but it was made independent in 1997. Several central banks have clearly become more independent over the past 10 or 20 years. The central banks of Scandinavia. Some people are nice enough to give Prescott and me some credit for that happening. I don't know if that's true or not, but I'll take the credit, of course. In practice, what some of the more successful banks have done is they've targeted inflation. They've said that our target is going to be, well, it could vary from country to country. It could be 2%, 3% a year. And the idea is if there is a shock to try to stay as close to the target as you can. This inflation targeting has seemingly worked well for 10 or 20 years now. I would argue that the test may still be still may yet be there to come. That was not a good sentence. Sorry. And a reason for that, I think, is that the central banks have not really been tested. There haven't been a big shock. We seem to be coming up. We seem to have seen a big shock now, and now we'll see how well they do. I would argue that, and this argument comes from, it's very much rooted in my understanding of the time inconsistency issue and its potential importance and also potential devastating effects. I don't think that inflation targeting is equivalent to price level targeting. So price level targeting could be something like you say the price level, our goal is to have the price level be so-and-so in 5 years, so-and-so in 10 years, and those levels could be consistent with an average inflation rate of, say, 2%. Okay, so that's why it would be natural to think that inflation targeting and price level targeting would be equivalent. A given price level movement is associated year by measured inflation rate changes. Inflation is defined to be the change per period of the price level. Now, what's likely to happen in the practice if there's a shock? Suppose there's a shock that makes inflation jump. Under price level targeting, you would be committed to bring the price level back to the original path so that you still be on target for reaching your goal over the next 5 or 10 years. With inflation targeting, my suspicion is that it would be very tempting, based on my understanding of the time inconsistency issue, it would be very tempting to say, oh, we were unlucky. It's true that inflation rose dramatically. We'll start our new path from here. Okay, from now on, the goal will still be 2% inflation increase per year. And in the end, that will mean a higher price level in 5 or 10 years than originally was envisioned. Now, let me talk about so I don't really think monetary policy is the main factor for economic growth. It's very important to provide a stable environment also for monetary policy, but I think the key factors are more from the fiscal side, and these are factors that could be driving innovative activity and technological change. You already got the idea from my presentation of the production function. Technological change is a driving force for the aggregate economy, for the output of goods and services, and therefore for the income of the nation's people. These are very much forward-looking decisions, but it's also important that along with innovative activity, the ability to produce goods cheaper or more efficient goods, or making more efficient machines and so on, along with that, it's important that you actually build those machines, you build those factories to take advantage of the technological change. And that's where the credibility of that nation is particularly important, is particularly crucial, and the government can contribute to adding to that credibility, or it can contribute to making that country not very credible at all. And here's where my example of Argentina I think will be very illustrative. Suddenly I got confused because I saw myself. I expected a picture of Argentina, and now there's me. Okay, so can everyone... There was a time when everything was over there, because I remember pointing in that direction, but for the first charts. So here's a picture of Argentina, and this plot of GDP per working age person starts in 1950, just like my previous three plots for a bunch of countries. Argentina did reasonably well until 1980. You saw in the first picture that reasonably well still meant that they were well below a bunch of other countries, but by Argentine standards, reasonably well until 1980. In 1980, or in the 80s, bad things happened. Some people call it the lost decade. It lasted exactly a decade, from 1980 to 1990. Output per working age person dropped by over 20%. A mind-boggling drop in output per working age person. Then Argentina seemingly recovered, maybe because of these policies instituted by Carlos Menem in part, that I already mentioned. And then in about 1998, everything fell apart again. And in that case, a similar 20% plus drop in output, GDP per working age person, and this time over only half the time. Devastating changes in that nation. So I got interested in this because Carlos Sarsaga and I were asked to study the 1980s to see what modern macroeconomics could say about the reasons for that Great Depression in Argentina. But after we were done with the work we were asked to do, we decided to, we had the numbers, we had the data, we might as well put the numbers into a modern macroeconomic model, calibrated to Argentina, and then see what happened. And we got a big surprise that said that in light of the high rate of productivity growth in Argentina, Argentina should have grown even much faster in the 1990s. The capital stock should have been much bigger. And here's an illustration of what we found. These are the data. Remember, these are not per working age person. This is simply GDP. So you don't see that big drop. The population growth keeps GDP from really falling much in in the 80s. But you see the big, seemingly big rise from 1990 to 1998. Then you get the big drop into 2002. The model says this is what should have happened. These are the data. Here's what the model says. And actually that rise, that peak for the model is almost 20% higher than for the data. That's an astounding difference. And so one can think about possible explanations, and to Carlos Sarsaga and me, it's pretty obvious. So the model was constructed on the assumption that everything was going nicely. Argentina didn't suffer from any credibility problems or anything like that. Well, that's obvious. That's evidently an assumption that one should not make. And our conjecture is that that Argentina fell prey to what we call the time inconsistency disease, and that's because of the memory people had, or potential investors had, from the hyperinflation that took place in the 1980s, and it wasn't the first one. Devaluations, deposit freezes, defaults on government obligations, all of that resulted in lack of credibility for Argentina. This is perhaps the most, except for the plot for Africa that you saw at the beginning, this is perhaps the most depressing picture in my talk. This shows the capital stock per working age person over the past 25 years or so. You see the peak in 1982, and then by 2003 it was down to 20% less than in 1982. Just a mind-boggling drop. While for most countries, the capital stock has either remained unchanged or been rising. So a developing country is typically characterized by the capital stock rising per working age person. So we could ask ourselves, will Argentina ever recover? And there's no easy answer, because once you lose the credibility, we don't know much about how you can restore it, other than convincing people that you are indeed trying to conduct policy for the long run, not just focusing on the next month or half a year or so on. You need to convince the relevant decision makers you are worried you are providing an environment for the next 5 or 10 years or more. So as I already said, the key has to be in policy. Promoting economic development must be a focus on incentives for productivity growth, innovation, and capital accumulation. And I saw a signal from my beautiful wife that I must be running out of time, and but I would like to mention the Ireland example as a contrast with Argentina before I close. So Ireland, you saw that it was hovering down there along the bottom of the 7 or 8 European countries for which I showed you a picture. And then it took off in the 1990s. There are at least 2 factors that must have been important. One was in the 60s and maybe early 70s, that's when Ireland decided to make secondary education free of charge. And so if we go 20 years later, Ireland finds itself with a potentially highly qualified, highly skillful potential workforce. But that's not enough. They also need to be productive. In the market sector, they need factories and machines. They need something to work with in order to to make that potential productivity come to fruition. And so what Irish policymakers did was they said that around 1990, if you invest in this country, if you set up factories here, and not just Irish potential factories, factories like Dell and others, if you set up factories here, these are going to be the tax rates you will be facing for the next 20 years. Not just next year, not just in 1992, 93, and so on, all the way to 2009. And that means, assuming it was credible, and evidently it was credible, you have removed the uncertainty about future taxes for the lifetime of the factory you might be thinking about building. And that's a very important thing. The government, there's enough uncertainty in the world as it is. It's kind of ridiculous, if you think about it, for the government to introduce more uncertainty than necessary. I have run out of time, so I'll just I'll skip this and simply end up. I kind of talked about these things, so I don't feel badly about skipping one slide. Let me just end with paraphrasing the conclusion of a book that I recommend to everyone to read. One of the books, modern books about economic developments by Parent and Prescott. It's entitled Barriers to Riches. It's actually a very compact book, not always so easy to read, but it has lots of good examples from various countries. And the conclusion was, paraphrasing it, with good policy, there is potential in poor nations for not 1 to 2%, but 1,000 to 2,000% income increase. Now, the authors obviously thought it was. They obviously thought that this was in the ballpark of what's possible. It's kind of cute to simply add 3 zeros to those to the 1 and 2, but it's not incredible, because if you think about a nation among the ones I had in the initial plots, remember that the most well-to-do nations had income or GDP per capita of about 30,000, 35,000. Some of the bottom ones, the ones for Africa, 500 maybe, 1,000. 1,000% increase, that's increasing tenfold. So that just brings you up from, say, 500 to 5,000, or from 1,000 to 10,000. And that should be doable. And I firmly believe that doing so, and I think there are lots of examples of that, and I think Elie Wiesel agrees with me, doing so will make the conditions much more favorable for lasting peace. Thank you very much.